There's a lot of things that are quite inspiring about playing historical equipment. By playing historical equipment, we're able to internalize and visualize the sound that would have been produced in the time. Following that trail and understanding that this is what made the music that you're now performing on, letting the mouthpiece guide you to the sound that it wants to make is quite inspiring. When we approach the natural trumpet as a modern player, for example, the first time I played, I was extremely taken aback because of how different it was. You know, I was kind of freaked out because I couldn't make a proper sound, or at least you can't impose your sound ideas and concepts upon this different instrument. You know, a lot of people will play the historical instruments, but with compromised equipment, basically with mouthpieces that are more akin to modern instruments. And the thing about that is you're not going all the way and you're not really understanding the true sound concept. One only needs to really look at the music in order to understand the demand for change in the mouthpiece development and understand what inspired these changes. Over the centuries, mouthpieces changed a lot, of course. The instruments of the time were designed much more as a utilitarian rather than musical. Over the years, these utilitarian functions such as, warning signals, battle calls, eventually became more ceremonial. And now you're playing, city events, heralding certain people, for example, and instruments started playing inside as opposed to playing outside, which led to dimensions generally getting slightly smaller. Eventually we get into the more musical function of the instruments. The differences that you'll see really are the fact that when it's a utilitarian purpose, when it's a signal or when it's a warning call, the thing that we need the most is volume. We need to cover as much of a distance as possible. So the internal dimensions of the mouthpiece reflected that by being large, and the instrument was large, and it allowed sound to travel further. 16th century is when you started to see mouthpieces and instruments being made for more musical functions, and before that it was a lot cruder, you could say, in design. It was more like just a piece of metal that was shaped into a bowl and had a tube stuck into it, and that was the mouthpiece. It took a long time and it took a lot of energy and brain power in order to make these changes, because it wasn't simple and it was complex and it was difficult back then to make a mouthpiece tailored for more musical demands as opposed to just making a sound. Historically appropriate mouthpieces allow me to create the sound that would have existed in the era. But essentially, the mouthpiece is an air to sound converter. So I'll demonstrate. The main difference between historical mouthpiece and modern mouthpiece is the general size. As you can see, of course, one is larger, but it's really the internal dimensions that make the biggest difference. There's many different types. That's also what we need to realize. There was never one particular type of mouthpiece, and they did have functions. For example, this mouthpiece was designed later. This was designed in the 17th century approximately. So after it was a utilitarian purpose, this was more of musical design. This was a mouthpiece that was designed for playing in the high register, for example. But this one would also be considered a general mouthpiece for, the high register, low register, but you can see how they're very, very different. Notably, this one is larger in terms of the inner size of it, the inner rim size, and the throat, the hole. and the actual backbore, which is the size of the inner dimensions. Well, it's important to match historical equipment to their respective instrument because at the end of the day, we're trying to recreate a sound world. By playing a historical instrument with a modern mouthpiece, you're basically tailoring your sound to more of a modern aesthetic, as opposed to by letting this historical mouthpiece lead you to a sound that would have been more appropriate and compelling. By putting a modern mouthpiece into a historical trumpet, for example, you start to see a lot more bright qualities in the upper register and narrower sound in the lower register, and it's quite the opposite aesthetic. So you see how far away you can really get, even just with something like the mouthpiece.